Tonight on KQED Newsroom, communities are reeling in the aftermath of multiple mass shootings in California in recent days. We'll talk with KQED reporters who have been covering the tragedies. And gun violence and gun ownership are on the rise in the Asian American community. We discuss this alarming trend with the executive director of the AAPI Victory Alliance. Plus, what's the future of transit in San Francisco? We speak with Muni Director Jeff Tumlin about the agency's financial woes and his vision for better public transportation in the city. Also, ancient artifacts glitter and gleam in this week's edition of Something Beautiful. Coming to you from KQED headquarters in San Francisco, this Friday, January 27th, 2023. Hello and welcome. This is KQED Newsroom, and I'm Priya David Clemens. We have had multiple waves of gun violence in recent days, spanning the state from Southern California to Half Moon Bay to Oakland, leaving at least 25 people dead. The motives behind the shootings are varied and murky. What is clear is the devastation left behind in the wake of these tragedies. Joining us now are two of the KQED reporters who've been on the scene in Half Moon Bay, talking with community members about the shooting deaths. Politics and government reporter Guy Marzorati and co-host of the California Report, Madi Bolaños. Thank you both for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
So, Guy, let's start with you. Tell us about how the farming community there is responding. These shootings happened at two agricultural facilities. How did this unfold through the week, and where does the investigation stand now?
Yeah, so this all started on Monday. Basically, two shootings at separate mushroom facilities in Half Moon Bay, being viewed right now as an act of workplace violence. The shooter going to these two facilities, he worked at one, used to work at another one, and targeting either co-workers or former co-workers, and then actually potentially trying to turn himself in. He was found at a sheriff's substation. That's ultimately where he was arrested, where he was found in his car. And that's, kind of where the investigation stands. This is now in the hands of San Mateo County's district attorney.
All right. Madi, what more can you tell us about the suspected shooter and his possible motives here?
The suspected shooter is Chung Lee Zhao, and he is being charged with 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. We also know that he is a Chinese citizen, and in an interview with NBC Bay Area, he mentioned that he does have a green card, and also that it wasn't difficult for him to obtain the weapon back in 2021.
All right. Guy, you visited a reunification center there. Tell us about what you're hearing from people there in the community and how they're responding.
Yeah, I mean, this was a reunification center that was set up at a community hall just hours after the shooting had taken place. Obviously, an incredible amount of grief on the inside, family members just learning of this news, and also a real scramble for law enforcement to try to get information to family members, try to track people down. The fact that family members of these victims, live in many different countries around the world, that was, I think, in large part a reason why it took days for just the names of the victims to come out, just the difficulty in contacting families and in providing appropriate language services and, other things like hotel rooms and just basic services at the scene as this week has played out. But I'll tell you, Monday night, you saw just a stream of volunteers, of members of the community showing up at this reunification center with blankets, with food, with coffee, trying to help out. I mean, I talked to one woman pretty late into the evening who had showed up to volunteer. She said she had spent the last 2 weeks helping out with folks who had been evacuated during the flooding that really hit these coastside communities, led to, damage at farms, farm worker housing getting flooded, and so just kind of compounding crises for these communities.
Wave after wave coming at them. Madi, you've also been speaking with people, some of whom knew victims, also some who knew the shooter. Tell us what you're hearing.
Yeah, people are devastated and honestly really shocked. Everyone that I spoke to said that Half Moon Bay is a peaceful, tightly knit community, and so they really never expected something like this to happen. I spoke to some people who knew Marciano Martinez Jimenez, and that's one of the victims, and they all said, they were from the same pueblo as him in Oaxaca, Mexico, and they knew him pretty well. And like them, he was just here to work hard and send money back to his family back in Oaxaca. So to hear that he was senselessly murdered was really heartbreaking for them to hear. And then there's ALAS, which is Ayudando Latinos a Soñar, and they're a community organization, and they say that they're gut-wrenched. I mean, they knew all the victims, and they also served the shooter, so they are very close to this tragedy.
Governor Newsom was out there this week to speak with the community. Guy, he really shone a light on the conditions that people are living in there. Let's take a listen to that first.
Some of you should see where these folks are living, the conditions they're in. Living in shipping containers. Living in shipping containers. Folks getting $9 an hour. You want to verify the California minimum wage? Not $9 an hour.
What do you think about his comments, and is there action being taken now?
I mean, that was kind of like a record scratch moment when he said that. He started this press conference. You expect him to talk about gun violence, political response, and it was right off the bat talking about these, housing conditions, the fact that farm workers there are not being paid California's minimum wage. And it's like, did the governor just say he is witnessing wage theft right in front of his eyes? And, in the subsequent days, his administration has said they're looking into these, into these farms and kind of the conditions that they're providing. In addition, we did hear the governor lay out kind of the political response to this. He took aim at Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House, and kind of Republicans' response to this. I will say,
because they haven't spoken about it at all.
Up until that point, he was just saying basically McCarthy, despite being from California, you had these pair of shootings happen, saying he has not given enough of a response, and then frankly calling out the party for kind of their stance on gun control and legislation to that effect. I will say, though, I did sense just kind of political fatigue on this issue. I mean, Newsom even admitted it. He didn't go to press conferences in Monterey Park when the shooting happened down there. He opted to just spend time with members of the community, talk to small business owners, because I think you get to a point where it's like, what more can I say? And so I think that's kind of the fatigue you might be hearing from lawmakers. In addition to the fact that, yes, California's passed a lot of progressive legislation when it comes to guns, and even though experts are saying a lot of that has made a big difference in stopping mass shootings, there is no press conference, there is no moment marked for a shooting that doesn't happen. Right? It's lawmakers show up to these events when a tragedy like this does, and I think you're sensing that fatigue from a lot of them.
All right, and in the last 30 seconds we have here, I do want to just switch tracks for a moment. Video was released today of the attack on Paul Pelosi. We're not showing it because it is very graphic, but Nancy Pelosi spoke afterwards, saying that she won't be watching it herself.
She did, and she thanked law enforcement response. I should note this was, KQED and a number of other media organizations actually filed a motion to get not only this video released, but also some of the interviews, that happened after the fact with police, despite both, the defense and the district attorney's office, not wanting this out at this point.
All right. Guy Marzorati, Madi Bolaños, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
The attack in Monterey Park in Southern California occurred just as celebrations for the Lunar New Year were underway. There, 11 people were killed and 9 more injured when a shooter opened fire at a crowded dance studio. The gunman is suspected to be an older Asian man, and several of the victims were also of Asian heritage. Guns and gun violence have been more prevalent in the Asian American Pacific Islander community in recent years, and our next guest says that's in part because this group has been targeted by the gun lobby. Joining me now is AAPI Victory Alliance Executive Director Varun Nikore. Varun, thank you for joining us here.
Thank you.
So tell us about the intersection we're seeing here between the recent gun violence and the AAPI community.
Well, this is a newer phenomenon in that both of these acts were committed likely by Asians, and they were also targeting Asians, right? So in addition to that peculiarity, they were also older Asian men, which doesn't really fit the profile. So I think there's going to be a lot to unpack going forward. And, are we providing perhaps enough mental health services for those in need? So we're just in the early days of this, but I think a lot of the on-the-ground community organizations are responding in kind, and we're trying to do all we can at the national level to bring a little bit more attention to this dire situation.
The gun industry has really been targeting Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, especially since perhaps the shooting in Atlanta, where several Asian women were killed who had been working at spas there. And also in the wake of the anti-Asian sentiment that we saw really rise during COVID. Can you tell us about the impact this is having as the gun lobby really trains its sights on the Asian American community in terms of looking to expand its gun sales?
So two things. One is that there was actually a flattening of gun sales in the late 2000s, 2019 to 2020 timeframe. And so the gun industry started looking at, okay, well, what can be captive markets going forward? And they've done, psychological profiles essentially on the AAPI community and said, we're going to start marketing to this community directly. And there's been ads and direct marketing campaigns. They've started to put Asian Americans' faces in gun catalogs. And we have resulted in kind by actually purchasing guns because we're a community in fear.
I think that's important. As you're saying, it's we, right? You and I are actually part of this community as well. I do want to share one of those ads that you just mentioned. Let's take a quick listen to that.
My name is Chris Chang, and I'm a gay Asian American professional sports shooter and a proud lifetime NRA member. I implore Asian Americans to join us in defense of freedom and our universal right to self-defense.
What do you think, Varun, when you see ads like this come out?
I'm absolutely heartbroken. In addition to the mis and disinformation that's actually being perpetrated by the NRA in these ads, I don't think that there was likely not one mention of gun safety in this ad. The NRA used to be known as the premier gun safety organization. I actually went through NRA training when I was in the Boy Scouts growing up. And so this entity now has turned into a organization that strictly lobbies on behalf of the gun industry. And as they expand into new markets, unfortunately, the AAPI community is a captive audience.
You did a poll last summer and you learned that apart from economic concerns, gun control is really top of mind. It is the top of all of the concerns for the 2000 AAPI respondents.
This was shocking to us. It had always shown up as a top 10 issue in surveys going back over the last 10, 15 years or so. And what was really alarming for us is gun violence, gun control, top issue, top non-economic issue. Now, this poll was fielded somewhat after the Uvalde incident, but I'm sure in the minds of a lot of folks, the Atlanta spa shootings and shortly thereafter the shootings in Indianapolis against the Sikh community was also in mind as folks responded to this. But this, I think, proves more than anything that all our community organizations, as well as the larger gun violence prevention movement, needs to take a little bit more attention to the fears that were being driven post-COVID in our responses in terms of buying guns and our concern of gun safety and gun control.
We've touched on it a little bit with mentioning these different groups who have been impacted, but the AAPI community is not homogenous. It is not a monolith. It's a lot of different people from different communities and cultures, many, many languages spoken. How does that impact your work as you look to amplify the power of the voice as a community politically?
So we are the most complex. We represent over 20 major nations. We speak over 100 languages and dialects. We are the most complex demographic in the United States, bar none. We are not bound by a common language. And so that does make our political activation efforts and our outreach much more complicated. But what we really have to do when we go in and organize certain communities in certain states is we essentially have to develop at least a minimum of 5 campaign and outreach plans.
And you have a lot coming forward in the next couple of years because political election cycles ramping up again. We've got a presidential campaign on the horizon.
1 year from this month, we will have the first caucus, first primary. So there's going to a lot to unpack, but no doubt that this situation is going to be another impetus for political activation of the AAPI community. We've seen record turnout in the Trump years, and I can guarantee you that this is going to lead to further activation and outreach. And I think our politicians and our policymakers really need to pay attention to this moment.
Okay. AAPI Victory Alliance Executive Director Varun Nikore, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Turning now to urban affairs. In San Francisco, the Municipal Transportation Agency, called Muni, is in charge of all transportation, from buses to rail to cars to street closures to bicycles to parking meters. Like all transportation agencies, Muni experienced a tremendous drop-off in ridership during the pandemic. The agency is now in a recovery phase. Working from home remains popular, which means there's much less traffic going to downtown San Francisco, resulting in lower revenue. Joining us now to discuss this time of change and what lies ahead is Muni's Director of Transportation, Jeffrey Tumlin. Jeff, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Priya. It's great to be here.
So you took over leadership of the agency in December 2019, right before the pandemic. You got walloped by it, like so many other transit agencies. Take us through a brief history of how the agency has done from then to now, the roller coaster, if you will, of the highs in ridership, the pandemic lows, and where you stand at this point.
Yeah, so in December of 2019, I was very excited to be working on solving some of the agency's structural problems, dealing with capital project delivery, dealing with agency culture, and modernizing the organization. And of course, 3 months later, we were in lockdown. And Muni ridership dropped to nearly zero, our parking revenue dropped to zero, and we were facing the worst financial crisis in our agency's history. I'm really proud of the way the agency pivoted in order to protect the health and safety of our workforce and to restructure the whole transit system in order to accommodate completely different patterns of travel. To focus on essential workers, to focus on getting people to the medical institutions and the other essential institutions that were still open, as opposed to serving office commuters to downtown that no longer existed. So we rebuilt Muni 7 times. Wow. In order to make it more efficient, in order to simplify it so that we could make the system work for who was traveling. We also built 21 miles of new transit-only lanes in order to make sure that Muni could be faster and more reliable in order to meet social distance requirements on the buses. We eliminated schedules and switched to what we call headway management in order to make Muni more reliable, at least on its main lines, than it has ever been in our recorded history.
So is the revenue starting to come back at this point?
Well, so the MTA is an enterprise organization. We're expected to be self-funding, and historically we've been funded through transit fares, parking fees, and then a fixed chunk that we get from the city's general fund.
And that's a third, basically.
Roughly speaking. So parking is down about 15%. Transit revenue is down about 60%.
Down off the highs before the pandemic.
Correct. And so we're sustaining ourselves through one-time federal relief. That money was expected to have run out over a year ago. We've been spreading it out because we knew San Francisco's recovery would be slow, but we fall off what would be called a fiscal cliff in fiscal year 24. So we've been shifting money out of our Department of Transportation funds in order to sustain Muni and buy us some more time. But the conditions are dire now, and we're going to need either funding from the state, additional bridge funding, or we're going to need to identify new sources of revenue within San Francisco, or we'll be facing pretty significant service cuts yet again.
This is all happening. You're at this point now with even more economic headwinds coming your way, right? Because Mayor Breed has said there's a $728 million shortfall in the budget that the city is facing. She's asking all departments to cut. So are you looking at cutting at Muni as well?
Yeah, so we will have to. Again, we've got some one-time funding that will buy us time, but the cuts to the general fund shorten our timeline for when we're going to need some additional relief or new funding, or we'll need to cut service. In the meantime, we're continuing to cut maintenance, as the organization has done for over 50 years, in order to prop up operations, and that is not sustainable. We can see what happens when you cut maintenance by looking at the situation in Boston. We're also not investing in technology, and we can look at Southwest Airlines in order to see what happens if you don't keep investing in upgrading your technology.
Give me an example of what that looks like here in San Francisco. What sort of technology needs to be upgraded?
Well, all of our technology. So our train control system in the Market Street subway is loaded off of 5.25-inch floppy drives.
No.
We have to maintain programmers who are experts in the programming languages of the 90s in order to keep running our current systems. We have a technical debt that stretches back many decades.
So a lot of challenges to overcome.
Indeed.
All right, well, let's turn from the cutting and the challenges to what has been accomplished recently. The Van Ness bus rapid transit lane is open and running. The Central Subway line in Chinatown is open as of this month fully. And you have projects that are coming up as well. The Potrero bus yard is going to include housing, which is much needed in the city. Tell us a little bit about the expansions that have been happening and what you see coming up.
That's right. So we are getting far better success on Van Ness than we had thought possible. We're getting between a 25 and a 35% travel time savings for people on the buses and a dramatic improvement in reliability. We're also noticing that car traffic is flowing more smoothly because the buses aren't weaving in and out of traffic any longer. We had some delays on Van Ness, but we've applied the learnings from those mistakes made many years ago to our newest projects. So we're completely rebuilding Taraval Street and the utilities underneath it and the train tracks on top. That project is on time and on budget, and we'll be delivering significant improvements in rail reliability along with pedestrian safety along the length of Taraval Street in the Sunset. And we're also working on a busway the entire length of Geary from Market Street to about 33rd Avenue. The quick build portion of that is getting us also about a 25% improvement in travel speed, and that project as well is on time and on budget.
Okay. We did ask viewers to send in questions for you, and we got a flurry of them in. So thank you to everyone who wrote in. Let me share a couple of concerns because many of them came in around the bicycle stations that have been going in around the city. Kathleen Hines wrote and said, the bicycle stations are being installed everywhere. Does Tumlin have a special deal with the bicycle companies? How many disabled, elderly, and families with children can use bicycles for everyday transportation? And Mark Rabideau wrote, their agency is clearly biased against cars. In my opinion, they are being overly influenced to side with the uber-political bicycle coalition in a very biased manner. Please ask Mr. Tumlin why he remains so biased against car owners and parking. Now, parking is 1/3 of your budget. So tell us your response to these concerns.
Yes, so we hear these concerns a lot. First of all, I love driving. I got my driver's license on the morning of the day of my 16th birthday. And I recognize that driving a car is by far the most convenient mode of transportation for most people and an essential mode for a lot of San Franciscans. The challenge is that even our current economic situation notwithstanding, San Francisco is growing. The city just passed a housing element this week that will add 80,000 units to the west side of San Francisco. In order to make it possible for San Franciscans who need to drive to continue to be able to drive, we need to make sure that people who are interested in walking or biking or taking transit feel safe and convenient and that feels easy for them. And that's because of the geometry of transportation. When I drive, I take up 10 times as much roadway space as I do when I walk or I bike or I take Muni. And so as the city grows, we're no longer demolishing neighborhoods in order to widen roads. My task is, how do I take San Francisco's limited streets and manage them to move more people? And that means focusing on the most space-efficient modes of transportation in order to benefit the people who do need to drive. That's our challenge. It's really a geometry problem and one that requires making some hard choices.
Another question came in about fares on Muni, and Paludo wrote, is public transportation ever going to be free in the Bay Area? And could free transportation get people to drive less for a greener footprint?
So I would love to make Muni free. Driving is mostly free for people who are driving cars. The challenge is the way we fund transit in the San Francisco Bay Area. In order to make Muni free, I would either have to cut 20% of our Muni service, or I'd need to identify an additional $200 million a year on top of our structural deficit, which is now approaching $200 million a year as well. So that's our challenge, is how do we fund transit?
So in the last 30 seconds we have here, what, if you had a magic wand, what would you do to make Muni thrive in the coming years?
Well, the most important thing that we need is additional operating funding relief in the short run and a long-term plan to rethink how we fund public transit. So operating money is the thing that I most need, and then in addition to that is continued investment in making Muni fast, frequent, reliable, and safe.
All right. Jeff Tumlin, the Director of Transportation for Muni, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
The DeYoung Museum in San Francisco is currently showcasing an exhibit 3,000 years in the making, Ramses the Great and the Gold of the Pharaohs. Let's walk now through ancient Egypt in tonight's edition of Something Beautiful. Such an intriguing look into that time. Ticket sales for the show support excavation and conservation projects in Egypt. The exhibit runs through February 12th. That's the end of our show for tonight. Join us next week to talk about Afro-Surrealism with D. Scott Miller, managing editor at the East Bay Express. You can always reach out to us with questions or comments at knr@kqed.org. Find KQED Newsroom online or on Twitter, and you can find me on social media at Priya D. Clemens. Thank you for joining us. We will see you right back here next Friday night. Have a great weekend.